Lauren Elizabeth Spierer was born on the 17th of January of the year 1991 to parents Robert and Charlene Spierer. As a young girl, Lauren grew up in Scarsdale, New York, a quite affluent city located in southern Westchester County. In the year 2009, Lauren graduated from Edgemont High School, and shortly thereafter she enrolled at Indiana University, where she was all set to study textile merchandising. Once at IU, Lauren was very active in the Jewish community, even going so far as to spend her spring break planting trees in Israel. Throughout her childhood, Spear attended a Jewish summer camp called Camp Tawanda, and it was here where she would meet her boyfriend, Jesse Wolf, her good friend, Jay Rosenbaum, and various other future IU students, who would go on to become Spear's circle of friends once at university. To everyone who knew her, Lauren was a beautiful and good-natured young woman, the kind of person that no one could have guessed would be at the heart of a sinister mystery, one that is still unsolved to this day. Jesse Wolf was the boyfriend of Lauren Speer at the time of her disappearance. Not much is known about Jesse's early life, other than the fact that the two young people first met at the previously mentioned summer camp. Initially, Jesse and his parents cooperated with the authorities in their investigation fully. However, this wouldn't last long, with the mother, Nadine, even saying this on record about the Bloomington police, quote, "I don't think they're very adept at anything except giving kids drinking tickets. I don't trust them. Period." Nadine also claims that her son both took and passed the privately administered polygraph test, although this has not been confirmed by the authorities. It has been acknowledged by police, however, that Lauren had been contemplating breaking up with Jesse prior to her disappearance. The Wolf family currently resides in Long Island. Jason J. Rosenbaum was reportedly the very last person to ever see Lauren alive, and he remains a person of interest in the case to this very day. In the years since the disappearance, Rosenbaum went on to form Immovation Solutions, a Michigan-based company that promotes brands by developing advertisement video games for mobile device and social media platforms. They've even created an advertisement game for the brand 5 Hour Energy. Bloomington was eerily silent this time of year. Finals had all finished, and most students had already left town for the summer. Lauren Speer, however, had stayed behind. She was waiting for her boyfriend to finish his classes so that they could drive back to their New York-based homes together. 3 years prior, at a Jewish summer camp, Lauren had first met Jesse Wolf. Lauren had been a camp counselor in training, only 17 at the time that she first met the 19-year-old Wolf. Jesse had been a shy, soft-spoken, and kind boy, and the far more extroverted Lauren felt drawn to him almost immediately. However, counselors were expressly forbidden from dating their trainees, and so the young couple would sneak out together at night. Wolf's family resided in Port Washington, only about an hour's drive from where Lauren's lived in Scarsdale, and so the two young lovers were able to keep up their romance even after camp had ended. Jesse would often make the drive up to visit his girlfriend, and her family welcomed him with open arms. This continued all the way up until Lauren received some good news. She'd been accepted to Indiana University and would be joining her boyfriend in Bloomington that very autumn. However, after a happy 2 years spent together, their relationship had recently begun to dissolve. Throughout the months leading up to Lauren's mysterious disappearance, the couple found themselves having the exact same argument over and over again. Jesse, who was by now an upperclassman and would soon graduate, sought commitment, even going so far as to bring up the concept of engagement multiple times. Lauren, however, simply wasn't ready. She was young, in the prime of her life, and she craved excitement and adventure. Increasingly, she was feeling trapped and smothered in her relationship with Jesse. And on the evening of her disappearance, her boyfriend wasn't the only one vying for her attention. A new suitor was waiting in the wings, Corey Rossman, and Corey didn't much care that Lauren already had a boyfriend. To Lauren, Corey represented passion, excitement, and more than anything else, freedom. In the past, Jesse had displayed a bit of a jealous side, but he was completely unaware of this new suitor and threat to his relationship. So on that Thursday evening, Lauren found herself in a bit of a dilemma. Should she spend the evening with her solid, reliable boyfriend, or should she go with what was new and exciting? This question was still weighing heavily upon her mind as she got dressed, grabbed a bottle of white wine, and headed down the hall to a friend's dinner party in Smallwood Plaza, a student apartment building about 3/4 of a mile away from campus. Lauren was accompanied that night by her good friend David Rohn, a fellow sophomore. Scott Schwartz, another friend of the pair, was hosting the little get-together in his apartment. Compared to Bloomington's usual partying standards, this was a rather small, intimate affair. Several of the guests present were enjoying dinner while watching the basketball game, but Lauren wasn't one of them. She did, however, begin drinking as she sat on the couch and scrolled through her phone. You see, her and her boyfriend were arguing yet again. The previous few months had been hard on them both. On the same evening, Jesse was watching the game with some of his own friends. However, the two more or less kept in constant contact. And I'm sure this aspect of the relationship factored into Lauren feeling smothered by Wolf as well. Sometimes, distance can actually be a good thing for a relationship. After Lauren had finished her bottle of wine, a few guests at the get-together offered her some weed. Lauren was on the hunt for something a bit stronger, however, and unfortunately, something much more dangerous. Only a couple of floors above them was the residence of Brian O'Connor, Lauren's occasional plug. That night, Brian and his roommate were hosting their own party. Bloomington is a wild place, man. And so Lauren and her friend David made their way up to the other party, presumably in search of some illegal narcotics. At this party, students were busily downing shots of whiskey and vodka. Sometime throughout the night, O'Connor offered Lauren some cocaine, which she accepted. Very few people in her life even knew of Lauren's troubles with drugs. What had once been an occasional, fun thing to do on a night out was quickly becoming a bad habit. A few of her close friends had even noticed that over the course of the last few months, Lauren had been losing weight and looking extremely pale. In fact, her hair had even begun to thin out some. Another old friend of Lauren's from back home showed up at the party and ended up selling her and David 4 Klonopin pills. If you know anything about drug use, you know that it's usually a very bad idea to be mixing uppers and downers like this. Throughout this part of the night, Lauren was later described as being constantly on the move, walking back and forth between the two apartments and parties. And more often than not, she had her phone in her hand, texting her boyfriend. Within just a 20-minute period, the two exchanged 14 separate text messages. However, she also had a text from Jay Rosenbaum, Lauren's friend, and more importantly, the neighbor of Corey Rossman, her new suitor. The text read, quote, "Are you coming?" And so Lauren made the decision to forego meeting up with her boyfriend, instead heading over with David to meet up with Rosenbaum and Rossman. At approximately midnight, Lauren, along with David, left her building and headed over to the party that she was being urged to attend. Lauren was dressed in a loose-fitting white top, some black leggings and ballet flats. After a short stroll through the Bloomington streets, the pair arrived at 5 North Townhomes, a 4-story red brick building. As soon as Lauren arrived, Rossman came outside to greet her. The party itself was pretty typical of Bloomington. Within just moments of her arrival, the young woman was offered another shot, which she accepted, leaning on the kitchen counter for support. As the night played out, Rossman attempted many times to get Lauren on her own, and he finally succeeded when she spilled a drink all over herself, and he offered to throw her shirt in his clothes dryer. Rossman's apartment happened to be literally only steps away from the party. Rossman's roommate, Mike Beth, was working on a paper for a summer class when the pair arrived. Without hesitation, Lauren took off her shirt and Corey threw it in the dryer. The pair then proceeded to watch YouTube videos on the couch as Rossman attempted to convince Lauren to come out to the bars with him, as though what this situation needed was yet more alcohol. Back at the party, Lauren's friend David noticed that she was nowhere to be found, and so he texted her but received no reply. David was ready to call it a night. With phone in hand, he went off in search of Lauren. He quickly tracked her down to Rossman's and admonished her to put her shirt back on, which she promptly did. At around this same time, the party was breaking up. As everyone was making their way home, Rosenbaum stopped by to invite Lauren and Corey to come with him to Kilroy's sports bar. While Rossman replied that they might show up there later, David was busily trying to convince Lauren to return home with him. However, she declined, stating that she wished to go to the bars. Finally, David gave up, and as he was making his way back home, he sent Lauren one final text that read, quote, "Be careful. Let me know if you need me." If only she just returned home with David, then she would most likely still be alive today. Kilroy's was located only a few blocks away from Rossman's place. At the time, it was, and still is, one of the physically largest and most popular bars in all of Bloomington, which is really saying something. This is the literal definition of a party town. Even at this late hour, it was now quickly approaching 2 a.m. Lines would be stretched around the block during the school year. However, this was the summer, and so crowds were relatively light that night. Lauren was already stumbling when she reached the bar. However, she was able to breeze right past security by flashing her fake ID. Within the bar, the side patio area had been transformed into a makeshift beach, complete with real sand and fake palm trees. Almost immediately upon entering, Lauren stripped off her shoes and buried her toes in the sand. Corey went to fetch more drinks, but the pair wouldn't stay at Kilroy's long, with the two of them making their exit at around 2:30 a.m. As they walked out the door, Lauren could barely even stand, and on top of this, she was now barefoot after leaving her shoes behind. She'd also forgotten her cell phone, and that should give you some idea as to the state she was in. In my experience, teenage girls are rarely separated from their phones willingly. So now, barefoot and phoneless, Lauren headed with Rossman back to Smallwood. Approaching the front of the building, they used Lauren's key card to gain entry. Another swipe of her card got them in the elevator and headed up to the 5th floor. When they stepped out, they were only feet from Lauren's apartment. However, the young woman was beginning to fade fast, and she had to lean against the wall and close her eyes as Rossman urged her to keep moving. Behind them, the elevator dinged again as 4 large young men stepped out. After quickly appraising the scene, they didn't much like what they saw. One of these 4 young men just happened to be a frat brother of Lauren's boyfriend Jesse, a man called Adam Weiner. "What are you doing with this guy?" Adam demanded of Lauren. Lauren, however, did not respond. At this point, Rossman stepped in, trying to assure the newcomers that he would take care of Lauren. They weren't buying this, though, and the situation escalated to the point that one young man stepped forward and punched Rossman in the face, knocking both him and Lauren to the ground. Following this, the four young men fled, leaving Lauren and Corey lying there on the floor. This incident led to Rossman coming up with a new plan. He would take Lauren back to his own apartment, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Fate, destiny, foreordained, predestined, whatever you want to call it. Do you believe that your life is predetermined, like a script for some shitty Hollywood movie? Or do you believe that we just make it all up as we go along? Personally, I believe that there are strong arguments to be made for either case. However, if life was truly predetermined, then that would suggest that there is some greater meaning, some higher plan behind our existence. And as I sit here writing this, racking my brain, I just can't come up with a single good, valid reason that Lauren's life should have been cut so short. She had her issues, especially with drugs, but she was so young. She had plenty of time to still figure it all out, and I truly believe that she would have. Now, I know that Lauren is technically still missing, and yes, without the discovery of a body, we can't say for sure that Lauren has passed, and it certainly gives me no joy to say so now, but I feel that logically this is the case. And whether her young life was lost due to an accident, an overdose, or something more nefarious, it's still an utter tragedy, no matter what the case. And now, with all that being said, let's get back to the story. It was approaching 3 a.m. by the time that the intoxicated pair emerged out the front of Lauren's apartment building and back onto the now mostly silent Bloomington streets. Rossman's lawyer would later describe the two as, quote, walking wounded, but it was Corey who took charge of the situation, leading them both towards his townhouse 3 blocks away. However, on the very next block, the two veered left into a dark alleyway, and after walking 100 yards or so, they reached the halfway point, 10th and College, an apartment complex where several female acquaintances of Rossman's happened to reside. Throwing Lauren over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, Rossman hauled the barely conscious girl up to his friend's apartment and knocked on the door. However, there was no answer. The girls were asleep. It was 3 a.m. after all. And so Rossman gave up and retreated back outside with Lauren. By this time, all of the drugs and alcohol had really taken their toll on the petite young woman. But this didn't stop Rossman from continuing to press onwards. However, what Corey didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Lauren suffered from a rather rare heart condition called long QT syndrome, a genetic heart disorder that causes severe drops in blood pressure. As a teenager, the disease was serious enough that Lauren was forced to quit all sports, and her doctors advised her to avoid any activities that might cause her heart to beat abnormally. However, Lauren didn't especially like being told what she could and couldn't do, and so she never informed any of her friends about her condition. And in the 6 long years since her initial diagnosis, she hadn't really ever experienced any symptoms. This disease, however, can lie dormant for years before suddenly striking you down. As the two emerged back outside, Lauren attempted to walk on her own, but could barely make it through the building's parking lot before having to stop. Lauren was forced to sit in a nearby stairwell, resting her head against the wall for support, while Rossman continued to urge her onwards. However, when she did attempt to stand, she collapsed backwards, smashing the back of her skull against the unforgiving concrete. A woman who happened to be passing by at the time saw the fall and quickly inquired if Lauren was okay, but received no answer from the girl herself. Rossman, though, attempted to downplay the situation, claiming that Lauren was only drunk. This seemed to appease the stranger, and she walked off. Rossman then proceeded to pick Lauren up like an infant and carry her towards an alleyway that led back to his place. And so, Rossman helped Lauren onto the curve and whipped out his cell phone. At 2:55 a.m., he then placed a phone call to a friend of his back home on the East Coast. However, the call went straight to voicemail. After this failed attempt, Rossman threw Lauren over his shoulder yet again. The young woman's eye was now blackened from her many falls. Lauren clung to Rossman's shoulders as he carried her back to his place. And this is where the story gets a bit hazy. You see, back in the year 2011, there were no security cameras that covered this area. And due to the late hour, there were no potential witnesses walking around either. So what really happened inside that townhouse on that fateful night is really only known by Rossman and his roommate. Corey, however, claimed that he suffered a memory lapse due to the punch he'd received back at Smallwood. During subsequent interviews with the authorities, Rossman and his roommate described themselves as doing everything possible to care for a young woman who was in bad shape. However, their stories noticeably diverged, and in Rossman's case, even changed. And on top of this, yet another critical question remained. Who placed the 2 phone calls that were made around 4 a.m. from Jay Rosenbaum's phone? The simple fact remained that throughout her night out, Lauren had encountered literally dozens of witnesses, been picked up by security cameras multiple times, and left plenty of evidence behind. At least until she reached those townhomes, where she vanished without a trace. The official narrative goes that once the two were inside the apartment, Rossman, who was very intoxicated himself, vomited on the carpet and eventually passed out. This left his roommate, Mike Beth, to take care of Lauren. He attempted to persuade the young woman to just sleep over, but she insisted on returning to her own apartment. It was at this point that Beth phoned Rosenbaum for help. Eventually, Lauren made her way over to Rosenbaum's apartment, where he observed the dark bruise under her eye. And this is the point where those 2 calls were placed, with Rosenbaum claiming that Lauren was responsible for both. However, no one picked up once again. At 4:30 a.m., Rosenbaum reports that Lauren left his apartment, with the young woman last being seen standing at the intersection of 11th and College. She was still barefoot as she headed south on College. Tragically, Lauren Spierer would never be seen again. Most of us don't ever really think about where our garbage actually ends up. We simply just throw it away, whether in a trash can or dumpster, and for most of us, that's that. We're done. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But just try and take a moment here and attempt to imagine that you, yourself, has a loved one who's missing, and the authorities then inform you that they're searching a local landfill for your loved one's remains. I mean, just imagine how that would make you feel. Like trash, I expect. Well, that's exactly what happened in August of the year 2011, when the police conducted a 9-day search of the Sycamore Ridge landfill in Pimento, Indiana, which is actually located in my neck of the woods. In fact, I actually drive past it at least once or twice a month. And that landfill is where all of the garbage gathered in Bloomington is hauled, after a brief stop at a transfer station, that is. This investigation was a joint affair, with the Bloomington Police, the IU Police Department, and the FBI all taking part in the search. However, unfortunately, nothing of any real interest was found. The investigation pressed on, though, and by May of the year 2013, investigators had received over 3,000 tips concerning Lauren's disappearance. In April of the year 2015, the authorities announced that they were investigating a potential link between Lauren's mysterious disappearance and the brutal murder of another IU student, Hannah Wilson. On April 24th of the year 2015, after visiting Kilroy's, the very same bar that Lauren had visited on that fateful Friday night, Hannah went missing. Wilson was last seen getting into a taxicab right out front of Kilroy's. She was then driven off into the blackness of the night. In the following morning, tragically, Wilson's dead body was discovered lying in a field in Brown County. Daniel Messel, a local man, was arrested for the murder after the authorities found his personal cell phone lying on the ground close to the victim's body. However, in July of the year 2015, the authorities ultimately concluded that the two cases were entirely unrelated, despite their many and eerie similarities. Moving forward with the investigation, in January of the year 2016, the FBI searched a property located in the town of Martinsville, approximately 20 miles north of Bloomington. The property was connected to a man named Justin Wagers, who lived there with his mother and stepfather. In the past, Wagers had been suspected of having exposed himself to numerous local women. The FBI released a statement which asserted that they were, quote, following up on leads and tips in Morgan County regarding the disappearance of Lauren Spierer. However, if anything substantial came from this search, then it has yet to be publicly released by the authorities, and sadly, the investigation remains at this standstill to this very day. Over the intervening years, a number of theories have emerged in regard to what exactly happened to Lauren Spierer on that fateful Friday night. Lauren's parents have stated on the record that they believe their beloved daughter is tragically no longer with us. They believe that based on her sheer level of intoxication, Lauren may have been drugged while still at the bar, with someone having slipped something in her drink entirely unnoticed. The family has also voiced their suspicions concerning all the men their daughter was with that night, including her boyfriend, Jesse Wolf, due to the fact that they all refused to take police-issued polygraph tests. While her parents have never made any specific accusations, they do believe that the men know far more than they're letting on. And now let's get into some of the most popular theories concerning what could have happened to Lauren. In their interviews with the authorities, Lauren's friends informed them about her drug and alcohol consumption that night. Jesse Wolf's mother even asserted that years earlier, Lauren had been asked to leave the summer camp where she first met her son due to her abundant drug use. At the time, Wolf's mother even said, quote, "This poor little girl is not with us today because of her drug abuse." In fact, 9 months before her disappearance, Lauren had actually been arrested on charges of public intoxication and illegal consumption. Following her vanishing, police discovered a small amount of cocaine in Lauren's bedroom. In total, Rosenbaum informed the authorities that Lauren had drunk alcohol, snorted cocaine, and crushed up Klonopin pills that night, presumably to snort as well. And unfortunately, her rare heart condition only added to the danger. The far most common and accepted theory of her disappearance is that sometime throughout the night, Lauren overdosed and died. Completely panicked, and in order to avoid any possible criminal charges, the men she was with then disposed of her body. However, a private investigator who was hired by the Spierer family doubts this theory, pointing out that an accidental overdose hardly seems like enough of a motive to conceal her death, which brings us to our next theory. This is probably the briefest of the theories that we're covering today, and the one that the authorities consider to be the least likely. However, that isn't to say that it's impossible, and the police have acknowledged in the past that they haven't ruled it out. If the night truly played out the way that the men said it did, with Lauren walking off into the darkness on her own, both heavily intoxicated and possibly drugged, then it isn't out of the realm of possibilities that she could have crossed paths with a malevolent stranger, intent upon doing her harm. However, in order for this scenario to be true, then we have to accept the men's story at face value, and I'm not really sure that I'm prepared to do that. But what do you think? Could Lauren have crossed paths with a random psychopath on her way home that night? Until the discovery of a body, we certainly can't rule it out. This is another one that the authorities themselves don't put much stock in. However, that hasn't stopped internet sleuths from endlessly theorizing. After all, Messel was responsible for the brutal murder of Hannah Wilson, a case that bore many unsettling similarities to Lauren's own. I mean, Hannah was last seen leaving the very same bar that Lauren visited on the night of her disappearance. That, in and of itself, is pretty creepy. However, just like the police, I consider this theory to be highly unlikely for a multitude of reasons. I think what we have here are two entirely separate and unrelated tragic cases that just so happen to both take place in the same small college town. These are only 3 of a whole host of internet theories concerning Lauren's case. If you're so compelled, then I highly recommend doing your own research. It's quite the rabbit hole, and I've really only scratched the surface in this video. Personally, I view the accidental overdose to be the most likely scenario here. It isn't hard to imagine college students panicking and doing something drastic under those circumstances. After all, everyone involved in this case was still rather young at the time. However, this doesn't explain everything, and some of the men's behavior, especially Rossman's, was highly suspect. But I would never outright accuse somebody of committing a crime before even the police have. With all of that being said, it's important to not lose sight of what really matters here: Lauren herself. A young life was lost, and as a father of a daughter myself, my heart truly goes out to her family. If you're struggling with your own addiction issues, just know that I'm here for you, and it's never too late to get help. I got clean at the ripe old age of 30. Rest in peace, Lauren, and wherever you are, just know that you're still greatly missed, to this very day.